Uh, it is a great privilege to be at this great, well-known, world-famous university, and especially a great privilege to be at the cradle of the democracy movement in China. I come from the University of California at Berkeley, which started the free speech movement in America back in 1964, very much like the democracy movement in China, but still very much in the same spirit. What I'd like to do today is talk about the relationship between academic pursuits like cognitive linguistics and politics, and what is happening in America right now. It's probably very confusing to Chinese students to read about American politics. The reason is this. Right now, America is politically divided right down the middle, almost 50-50. George Bush did not get the most votes in the last election. Al Gore got the most votes by 500,000. But Bush won in a critical state where his brother was governor. There was a contested election about whether the vote was legal. And he won because the Supreme Court, which was appointed by his father, with justices appointed by his father, chose him in a decision which it said was unique and could not be used as a precedent for any other decision. In short, there was a lot of political corruption in the choice in that election. And it is remarkable that there was no protests in the streets and so on in America. And I think the reason for that is that America tries to be peaceful even under the worst conditions. But right now, America is divided, almost 50-50, between two utterly different views of politics, and with them, utterly different views of what morality is. This is something that is not widely known around the world, and is not widely understood. And what I'd like to do is give you some understanding of what politics in America is like today, and what kinds of issues are at stake there, and why it is that a minority party has been running the country. The conservatives are a very wealthy organization. These are the Republicans. They have become simply radical conservatives. And they're running America right now. They have all the branches of government, a majority on the Supreme Court, in both the Congress and the Senate and the White House. Not by much, a very, very slim majority, bare majority, but very close, even though the majority of voters are on the other side. And the question is, how have they done this? Moreover, the form of conservatism has become more and more right-wing. It is more and more radical as time has gone on. And one question one might ask is, how has that happened? The history of this is very interesting. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson won an election over a man named Barry Goldwater, who was the conservative candidate, by a huge majority. At that time, conservatism was of no interest in America. No one wanted to be a conservative. Between 1964 and 2000, the conservatives took over America. And the way they did it used a lot of their intellectuals. What they did was they invested a huge amount of money, $2 billion over 40 years, to build think tanks, that is, research institutions, political research institutions, politically oriented research institutions, to promote conservative values and to get them into the public domain, and also to spend a lot of money on media to turn the media to their political advantage. At the same time, the progressives, the Democrats in America, did nothing of this sort. Nothing. And during these years, the conservatives succeeded. What they succeeded in doing was figuring out exactly how they thought. Originally, the conservatives were in great disarray. They had lots of factions and so on. And they came together around a single political ideology that they could understand. And they instituted a language apparatus in the society. That is, a means of producing effective language for the media and training their politicians and at all levels in the use of this language. At the same time, the Democrats did nothing. And what happened over those years was that their language became the language of American politics, and their ideas defined the issues of American politics. The way do we say this in frame semantics within cognitive linguistics is they came to frame every issue. Now, what I've been involved in recently is the development of a politics institute separate from the university, a private politics institute, to try to reframe American politics from a more progressive perspective, one more democratic, because the conservative movement is actually a very anti-democratic movement, as we will see. What is happening in terms of their domination of American politics is actually quite dangerous, and we'll talk about why. But what I would like to do is try to give you some examples of why cognitive linguistics in particular matters for understanding all of this politics. First, let me tell you a little bit, if you don't, how many people attended one of my previous lectures, or one or more, just to get some sense? Okay, there are some who did not, and let me try to give you some sense of those who did not, some of the ideas, in a very simple way, behind cognitive linguistics. For example, if we generally think in terms of metaphor, and it's not obvious, it's not well known, but let me give you a very common metaphor used in thinking. In morality, around the world, one of the common metaphors for morality is accounting. It's like, adding up debts. So if I say to you, if you do me a favor and you do something good for me, I can say, I'm in your debt. I owe you one. How can I repay you? Right? So that doing someone a favor, doing something that increases their well-being, is metaphorically like giving them money. And therefore, to balance it out, you owe them something. You have to repay. You're expected to repay in some way. Now, if I do something to harm you, then moral accounting can occur in several ways. If I harm you, it's almost like taking money away from you. It's hurting you, in some way. And therefore, I can make up for it by doing something good for you. That's called restitution. If I harm you in some way, I can say, I'm sorry, I will make up for it. That's restitution. That's one way of settling the moral books. So that's another metaphor being used. But another variant of that in moral accounting is what is called retribution. If I do something to harm you, then you may feel the only way you can balance the moral books is by harming me back. That's called retribution, punishment. Another form is called revenge. If I do something to harm you, you can do something to take something good away from me. To harm me by taking something good away. And that is called revenge. So, and in Buddhism, you have the notion of karma, which says that if you do good deeds to the world, eventually, in this life or the next, good will come to you. That there is moral balance, eventually. Now, this is a metaphor, and it's one of the central metaphors for morality. And it's something very important in American life, which, as we will see as we go along. In general, what I discovered in looking at the American situation was that morality was central to it. And I discovered this in the following way. So let me tell you, by the way, how I got into this particular branch of research. Back in 1992, I watched the Republican National Nominating Convention for the presidency. This is the other side's, the conservative convention, on TV. And I watched the candidate for vice president give his acceptance speech. And I mainly wanted to see it because, although he wasn't a very interesting person, the speechwriter was. The speechwriter was a major conservative theorist, and I wanted to see what the speechwriter said. And as I listened to the speech, I found myself embarrassed because I could not understand the speech that this not very smart politician was giving, although everyone in the audience there on TV could understand it. So I decided, I understood every sentence. That was not the problem, sentence by sentence. I had no idea how the sentences fit together. So I decided to try to remember one argument, and it was an argument about taxation. The argument was about what is called the progressive income tax. In America, a progressive income tax is a tax where very wealthy people pay higher taxes than poor people, because the idea is that the wealthy people have gotten more from the society and owe more back, and that they're more able to pay. Now, conservatives are against the progressive income tax, and this candidate was giving one argument against it. The argument was in one sentence. The argument against the progressive income tax was, why should the best people be punished? That was his argument, and everybody cheered in the hall on TV, and I didn't understand why this was an argument against the progressive income tax, and everybody else, who were the Republicans, understood this. And I realized at that point that although I was a professor of semantics, although I had studied American politics all my life, I fundamentally did not understand American politics, because I couldn't understand what people who believed something else said, understood. Then, 2 years later, in the year that the conservatives took over the American Congress in 1994, during the election, there was a very radical conservative movement that where a group of radical conservatives went into the election with 10 promises. They said this, they called this the contract with America. We promise to do the following 10 things, and if you elect us. And the 10 things was a list. I looked at this list, and they were familiar things, but I didn't understand how the things on the list fit together. So, the list consisted of these things. If you elect us, we will promise to end all abortions for women. No women will be able to get any abortion. Okay? If you elect us, everybody will be able to own guns. Guns for everyone. if you elect us, we will have a lower income tax for wealthy people. If you elect us, we will get rid of all environmental regulations. We will, just nothing to stop pollution, nothing to stop the degradation of the environment. We will get rid of all of these regulations. If you elect us, we will have what they called tort reform. Tort reform means the following. In America right now, it is possible if a corporation does something to harm people. For example, if they build a car where they know the gas tanks will blow up, right? And somebody drives and there's a crash and the gas tanks blow up, and somebody dies, the family can sue the company. They said, we will not allow this. We will not allow lawsuits that will allow for very large settlements against corporations that do immoral things. Okay? And so on. There's a long list of these things. In foreign policy, we want to build up the army to be as strong as possible. Okay? These were among the 10 things. I looked at these 10 things and I said, these are very strange people. Oh, the other thing was, they promised to institute the death penalty everywhere for murder. Just have as much death penalty in as many places as possible. So I looked at this list and I said, what do these positions have to do with each other? What does being against abortion have to do with lowering the taxes of wealthy people? What does lowering the taxes of wealthy people have to do with allowing everyone to own guns? What does allowing people to own guns have to do with tort reform or building up, the military and so on? What are all these things? How do they fit together? And then I said to myself, well, I am against all of these things. I have the opposite views. And I asked myself, how do my views fit together? And I couldn't answer the question. Okay? Now, again, I had written a classic book called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things about categorization. And as an expert on categorization, I didn't even understand my own categories. That was very embarrassing. So I started wondering about how all of these things worked. That was the mystery to me. And I started to interview both liberals and conservatives. And as I did, I found that each thought the other was irrational. So, if you ask a liberal about conservatives, as I did, they will say, how could you be what they call pro-life, that is anti-abortion, and still promote the death penalty? How can you be in favor of life and in favor of the death penalty? And if you ask conservatives about this, they will say liberals are irrational. How could they not want to put a murderer to death but allow the killing of babies in abortion? Right? Each side thought the other was crazy. Now, when you see something like this, you understand that there is a different worldview involved. One thing we learn from cognitive science and cognitive linguistics is that our understanding of the world comes in terms of frames and metaphors, and most of these are unconscious. Most of these are not things that we know about, that we understand about ourselves. They're very deep, they are in our brains, in the synapses of our brains, and we understand the world without being able to understand the mechanism for understanding. And what cognitive linguistics is about is showing people what that mechanism for understanding is like. So I thought, this is an ideal problem for my profession, for cognitive linguistics. And I set about studying it. Now, that turned out to be a very difficult thing, but one of the questions I asked was the following. I had been doing research on metaphors for morality, like moral accounting. And Mark Johnson and I had discovered a set of about 20 or so metaphors that seemed to be universal. And when I started listening to the speeches of liberals and conservatives, I found that they used different metaphors for morality. And so I started writing down lists of who used which metaphors for morality. And when I got these lists done, I didn't understand them. But let me try to give you a sense of the metaphors for morality that I discovered, and then in a while you will see how they work in politics. There's a metaphor of what I will call moral strength. It says there is evil in the world, that there is an absolute right and wrong, and morality is uprightness. It is moral to be upright and to be strong. You need moral strength. And if you are morally weak, what happens? You need moral strength to stand up to evil. If you are morally weak, you will fall. That means you will become evil. So moral weakness is evil waiting to happen. It is immoral even to be morally weak. Okay? That is the metaphor of moral strength. And this occurs in many places around the world. And interestingly, it was one of the main metaphors used in conservative politics. Let's take some other examples. There's a metaphor that immorality is a disease, a contagion. It can spread. That you can catch immorality by being in contact with immoral people. What follows from this is that if you're raising children, you want to keep them away from bad people, because they will become immoral if they are in contact with bad people. So in America, what this means is has to do with racism a lot. In the inner cities of America, you have a lot of people who are not white. And they are seen by conservatives very often as being immoral. And so the idea is to get rid of public schools where everyone can go and have what are called vouchers for private schools, namely to privatize education so that the children of the wealthy and the children of moral people will not have to be in contact with these children of immoral people. Okay? And so what they do is they will move to the suburbs, or they will try to send their children to different schools. And they will be against the government funding education for everyone, because that means everyone will have to go to the same schools. Instead, they want government to give the educational money in the form of what are called vouchers, that is, slips of paper worth a certain amount of money, so that you could go to private schools, and then the private schools can choose what students they want, and you can segregate the society in terms of what conservatives see as morality. Okay? The result, of course, will be that the wealthy people will go to better schools and the poor people will go to worse schools. But that is, this is the idea behind what are called school vouchers. So one of the 10 things they promised to do was to introduce a school voucher program. This will have the effect of eliminating public education, because as more and more people pull their children out of public schools, the public school system collapses because it doesn't have enough finances behind it to support it. So that is one of the programs of conservatives. So I started looking at more of these things. Let me give you other metaphors for morality. There's a metaphor of what I will call moral essence or character. It's the idea is that you have some sort of virtue inside of you that you learn when you're young, or perhaps are born with, some sort of internal character. And what you do depends on your character. That is, your behavior comes from your essence or your character. And if you put the metaphor of moral essence and the moral strength together, you have a word, an expression like backbone. That says, what kind of backbone does he have means, is he morally strong, and what kind of character does he have? And conservatives like to talk about that issue, about backbone and character, because of moral strength, for reasons we will see in a while. There's others. There's a metaphor that morality is purity, is to be pure, and immorality is to be disgusting, impure in some way. And that's a very wide metaphor in the world. There's another metaphor that morality is nurturance, to take care of people, is care. And that immorality is not to care about someone. Okay? There are many more. We could go through this list, but I wanted to give you a sense of them. And they're not a random list. All of these metaphors come from one place, and that is the following. In general, morality concerns well-being. It has to do with the well-being of others and your own well-being. And morality is therefore, the metaphors for morality that occur around the world, what are called the primary metaphors, arise because of your experience in the world of two things coming together. Two different types of experiences coming together, forming a metaphor because they activate different parts of your brain, and you learn neural connections between those different parts. And those neural connections are the physical instantiations of metaphorical thought. So, for example, it is better for you, better to be strong than to be weak. You just function in the world better. Therefore, you have more well-being. Therefore, morality is strength. It's better to be healthy than to be sick. So morality is healthy and immorality is disease. It's better to eat pure food than to have impure food. So morality is purity. It's better to be able to stand upright than to have to crawl on the ground. Morality is uprightness. It's better to be able to function in the light than in the dark. So morality is light and immorality is dark, and so on. There are about 20 or 25 examples like this, where the basic metaphors for morality arise from conditions of well-being. Now, what I found was some of them were attracted to conservatives and some of them to liberals, but I didn't know why. It was a mystery. So, I then continued working, and I found another mystery. One of the major conservative theorists, political theorists, had written a big book, which was his most famous best-selling book, and it was a book of children's stories. And I said, why should a major political theorist be writing a book of children's stories? Moreover, most of the conservative candidates for office in America were talking about what they called family values. And I wondered why, when the issues of atomic war were at stake, why when the issues of starvation and poverty were at stake and so on, were people talking about traditional family values? And when I went into this and I started reading that literature, it occurred to me that one of my students had noticed a very deep metaphor in American life. It's the metaphor that the nation is a family. In America, we understand, in many places in the world, we understand large social groups in terms of smaller social groups like families and communities. And so we have expressions in America like the founding fathers of America, as if America were a family and the people who founded it were fathers. We have the descendants of the founding fathers are called the daughters of the American Revolution. When we have a war, we speak of sending our sons to war, as if the country had children. So the idea of the nation as family is a very common metaphor. And I reasoned that if it was the case that the nation is understood as a family, that you map from families to the nation and reason about the nation as a family, and if we have two different ways of understanding what the nation should be, conservative and progressive politics, then maybe there were two different kinds of families behind this. And so what I did was this. I took that metaphor, I took the forms of politics, and I turned the metaphor backwards. I actually stated the mappings, turned them backwards, and out popped two ideal models of a family, two utterly different models of what a family should be. And it turns out that these are in fact conservative and liberal models of family life in America. They are a strict father family and a nurturing parent family. So I'll tell you what they are and how they map onto politics. In an American strict father family, it is certain things are assumed. It is assumed that the world is a dangerous and difficult place. It's dangerous out there. There's evil in the world. It's hard to live in the world. And not only that, there's competition in the world, and there always will be competition. There will always be winners. There will always be losers, and your job is to be a winner. That's part of the background assumption. Another background assumption is that children are born bad and have to be made good. Okay? So those are the background assumptions. The reason you need a strict father is you need someone to protect you in the dangerous world, to win the competitions, and to support you in the difficult world, and to teach his children right from wrong, to take the kids who are born bad and make them good. And there's only one way in which the strict father can do this in this kind of family, and that is punishment. When the children don't do the wrong thing, they have to be painfully punished. They have to have painful punishment. Not just, go to your room, but painful punishment. And the reason is, this is called, the word for this is interesting. The word is discipline. It's physical discipline. The idea behind it is that if you physically punish or discipline your child, whenever they do wrong, then sooner or later they will get mental discipline, stop doing wrong, only do right. They will have discipline inside themselves. They will discipline themselves. And that is necessary for someone to be moral. So the assumption is the only way that people are moral, will follow the rules, is if they are disciplined and go against their natural inclinations to do the wrong thing. Okay? And just to keep themselves from doing that and only do the right thing. Now, in the strict father family, discipline has a secondary role. Because if you are disciplined, then you can follow your self-interest and become wealthy and self-reliant. Now, this is an important part of the strict father family, and it links prosperity to morality. It says the same thing that makes you a moral person, discipline, will make you a prosperous person if you follow your self-interest. Now, in this version of American life, in the conservative version, there's a further metaphor for morality. It's the morality of self-interest. It is moral to pursue your self-interest. Why? This, it turns out, is a version of American capitalism, and the form of capitalism introduced by Adam Smith originally in England. Adam Smith's metaphor was like this. He had a central metaphor called the metaphor of the invisible hand. The invisible hand refers to nature. And the metaphor goes like this. If everyone seeks their own profit, if they go around trying to make just as much money as they can, then the profit of everyone will be maximized by the invisible hand as a law of nature. Okay? That is Adam Smith's view of free market capitalism. And that view has a metaphorical version in the family. There's a metaphor of well-being as a kind of wealth, as we saw in moral accounting. Well-being is like wealth. And this says if everybody pursues their own well-being, then the well-being of everyone will be maximized. Therefore, it's moral to pursue your well-being and immoral to get in the way of someone else pursuing their self-interest, their well-being. Okay? So the idea here is that given the morality of self-interest and discipline, a disciplined person pursuing his self-interest without being interfered with should be prosperous. Okay? And moreover, it says, if someone isn't prosperous, that means they're undisciplined. And if they're undisciplined, they cannot be moral because they can't follow the rules. They will do immoral things. So, the bad people are the poor people. The poor people deserve to be poor. And the rich people deserve to be rich because they're the disciplined people. And this is an answer to the question about taxation. Remember, why should the best people be punished? The best people are seen as the rich people, who are the disciplined people, whose wealth shows that they are moral. Okay? That is part of the conservative ideology in politics, but also the conservative model of the family, a strict father family. Then there's another part of this model, which is that when a child is grown up and reaches maturity, they will either be disciplined or not. If they're not, they will become dependent upon other people, and they should not be taken care of anymore. They should be given tough love, thrown out into the world to be disciplined by the world. And if they are moral, then they don't need a strict father anymore, and the strict father should not meddle in their lives, should not tell them what to do anymore. Now, this meddling in their lives has everything to do with government. The idea here is that the government is like a strict father, and the job of the government is to protect, to tell you what's right and wrong, but when the children, the mature children, who are the good children, who know what's right and wrong, those children should no longer be under the control of the government. They should be free to do what they want. But the dependent children should be made to be more disciplined still. Okay? Now, let's think about what this means in politics before we go on to the other model. Why is this way of raising children political? It maps onto politics in the following way. In American politics, in the history of American politics, one of the great achievements came from Franklin Roosevelt, what was called the New Deal. In the American Depression in the 1930s, what Roosevelt did was create a number of what is called public welfare and public works programs. For example, he would create jobs where the government would pay people without jobs to do good things, like build parks, build schools, build good public buildings where there were none, build libraries, okay? Do good things for the common good while using the government money to stimulate the economy and pay people. Right? That was part of it. Another part of it was what was called Social Security. That is, there were a lot of old people who, after they couldn't work anymore, had no money and were impoverished. And if they got sick, they couldn't afford doctors and so on. And so Social Security was started. It was a way that said when you are earning a living, you pay a certain amount into an account in the government, and the government keeps that until you're old. And when you reach the age of 65 and retire, then you get this money back, but in a higher amount because it's been invested somewhat, in a higher amount, and then you can be at least minimally supported in your old age. And at least you won't be impoverished. And later on, in the 1960s, an extension of that was put in called Medicare, where you paid a certain amount into the government for medical insurance for your old age, so that after you retired at 65, then you registered for Medicare and you could get free medical help when you needed it. Okay? Sort of medical care for old people who no longer had a working income. It was a very, very great thing for the poor in America, and it stabilized America. Very great. It was seen by progressive people and the Democrats as a great achievement. It was seen by the conservatives as awful. And the reason it was seen as awful was that it was seen as making people dependent on the government. That is, it was seen as taking away discipline. So all social programs, so for example, programs for to send people to college if they couldn't afford to go to college, was seen as an evil. That is, if you believe that people have to be disciplined to be moral, and that anyone who is disciplined can just make money on their own, then otherwise, to help them out is seen as immoral. So all social programs, Social Security, Medicare, all of these things were seen by conservatives as immoral, to be wiped out. And they were seen as well as making people dependent, hurting the people they were supposed to help. And so conservatives have had as a goal to get rid of these social programs. Now, one of the ways in which they did this was very clever. When Bush came into office, he had a very interesting bit of linguistic framing. On the day that he came into office, the White House started putting out press releases about what they called his tax relief plan. Tax relief. Now, the idea here is that taxation is an affliction. That is, if you think about the linguistics of this, in order for there to be relief, there has to be an affliction, someone who is harmed by an affliction, an afflicted party, a harmed party, a reliever who takes that affliction away, who's a hero, and if someone tries to stop their reliever, they're a villain. They're a bad person. Okay. Now, tax relief says that taxation is an affliction. Now, taxes are what in America paid for Social Security, for medical care, for schools, for all sorts of things, public education. So for many people, taxation was an investment in a moral society, and a fair society. But for conservatives, taxation was seen as an affliction and a burden because the rich were paying a higher proportion than the poor, and they said the rich were therefore being punished for being good people, being rich. So from their point of view, people needed tax relief. Okay? Now, President Bush, therefore, cut taxes on the wealthy. And the result was that the government got a lot less money. When it got less money, it couldn't afford all the social programs to help people. And they started cutting social programs. And they went into a deficit. America now is in a big deficit. This is not an accident. It was planned. It was planned by conservatives as a way to get rid of social programs so that the government couldn't pay for them. Okay? So it's a very interesting part of American politics to understand, what conservative politics is about. Now, let's think about foreign policy. What does this say about conservative foreign policy? It says that in foreign policy, America is seen as the most powerful nation and therefore the strict father of nations. The nation who knows right from wrong, who is the moral authority. And other nations, third world nations, are seen as children nations who should listen to the strict father, who should obey. So, from the conservative point of view, should the U.S. go to the United Nations to ask what it should do in Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever? No. The U.S. doesn't have to ask anything, just as the strict father doesn't ask the children what to do. Right? So the U.S. doesn't ask third world nations what to do. It knows what to do, and it's going to do it. It might ask for support, but it's not going to ask them for advice or cooperation. It's just going to say, go along with me, because I know best. That is a conservative view of the world, and it is what has led American foreign policy under George Bush. Now, there's a lot more. We could go through all the other positions, and this book, Moral Politics, does that. But I'd like to give you a view of what the other half of America believes, because that's only one half. The other half, the slightly larger half, believes something totally different. And it has a different way of raising children. It has what is called a nurturing parent view of the family. So let me tell you what a nurturing parent view of the family is. It's a view that says both parents are responsible equally. That the world can be made better. It may be difficult, but it can be made better, and it's your job to help make it better. It also says that the job of a parent is to nurture, that is, care for their children, and to turn their children into nurturers of others. That is, to make their children nurture so that they will want to nurture and care for others. That is the job of a nurturing parent. But what is nurturance? Nurturance is two things. First, empathy. Empathy means connecting with someone else, feeling what they feel. A parent must know what every baby's cries mean. Does the baby have to be changed? Is he hungry? Does he have to go to sleep? Right? That is nurturance, right? So empathy is required. The second is responsibility. If you're a parent, you are responsible for a child, and you can't take care of a child unless you are taking care of yourself, so you're also responsible for yourself. So in order to raise a child and be a nurturing parent, you have to empathize with the child and be responsible for yourself and responsible for the child. Now, from those two principles, empathy and responsibility, many things follow in the nurturant family. For example, if you empathize with the child, you will not want the child to be harmed. So, you will want to protect the child. So protection is a very important value. How does this show up in politics? It shows up in politics in democratic ideas, that is, progressive ideas like environmental protection, consumer protection, worker protection. Okay? All of those are very important ideas in progressive politics. Okay? Another example. If you empathize with a child, you will want the child to have a happy, fulfilled life. You want the child to be able to do as much as he can with his life. And this shows up in politics by saying that the Democrats want everybody in society to be fulfilled as much as possible. Okay? That it is the role of the government to work for the fulfillment of all the people. Okay? Because your job is to nurture others. So that's the political consequence of that. If you want your child to be fulfilled in life, then you'll want your child to have enough freedom to be able to do that. Because you can't fulfill your life unless you're free to do so. So, this comes into politics in the idea that individuals should be as free as possible, provided they don't interfere with the freedom of others. Okay? So the idea of freedom and that ideal is part of the progressive values. Another part of this is fairness. That is, if you empathize with your child, you will want your child to be treated fairly. This comes into politics in the idea of fairness, because then you will want everybody in the society to be treated fairly. And that is one of the ideals of progressive politics. There's another ideal, which is if you want your child to be free enough to be fulfilled in life, then they have to have opportunities. They have to have opportunities to get a job, go to college, get educated, and so on. Have families, have houses. They need opportunities. For opportunity, you need prosperity. So opportunity and the cultivation of a general prosperity for everyone is part of democratic values. In order to cultivate prosperity, and in order for children to be raised with appropriate values to care for others, every child is raised in a community. And you can't just raise your child by yourself. Other people will affect your child. So it's important to build community and maintain community. And community building is a major part of progressive politics. That is, building and maintaining communities. Now, if you're going to build and maintain a community, that requires cooperation. Not just competition, cooperation. You have to be able to cooperate in building and maintaining communities. Cooperation requires trust. Trust requires honesty. So trust and honesty are major progressive values. And if you're going to raise a child and you're going to empathize with that child, you have to be able to know what the child needs, and that requires open communication. And in politics, that translates into openness of government. That is, the citizens should be able to question the government, to know why the government does what it does, to have access to all the documents, and so on. That is, open communication is a progressive value. Basically, the nurture parent family maps onto progressive politics, and every progressive policy in America is an instance of those values. So one can see immediately that, for example, on social programs, Social Security, Medicare, etc., the progressives are going to be in favor of it, the conservatives will be against all social programs. In international relations, the progressives will be in favor of global cooperation, of helping poor people around the world have better lives, of having cooperative global leadership rather than imposing just one's will on other countries because you're a moral authority. So you have a very different idea of what foreign policy is if you're a progressive and have a nurture and parent view of the world. So what's interesting about this is that the idea of family life structures a huge amount of American politics, and America is just split down the middle historically right now between these two utterly different views of what morality and politics are about, of what a government should do, about what a good person is like, about what a good family is like. They're completely different views. And one of the interesting parts of this is the following. These models are actually in everyone's brains. That is, when you learn a model of this sort, or a metaphor, that metaphor is in your brain physically, in the synapses of your brain. It doesn't just go away simply. It's there. But everyone has both models if they grow up in American culture. But it may be active or passive. So, for example, if you're a political progressive, you also have a conservative model, because if you can understand a movie like a John Wayne movie or an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, which is a sort of uses the conservative model, if you can understand it, then at least passively you have that model in your brain. If you are a conservative and you can watch, say, a TV show called The Bill Cosby Show, which is about a nurturant family, if you are conservative and you understand that show, if you can watch it and understand it, as just about anyone can, then you at least have a passive nurturant model. The question is, which of these models do you live by? Which is active in the way you live your life, and which is just used for understanding other people? Now, in America, in American politics, one thing that political leaders know is that certain people, for the sake of elections, are absolute conservatives, and another bunch of people are absolute liberals, and they're not going to change. As they have the active conservative or liberal model for politics. And that number of people is roughly between anywhere from 35 to 45%, somewhere in there. It used to be between 35 and 38%, but the numbers seem to be going up on both sides. And they will determine which view of the world dominates the American government. And there are very different views of the world. Now, when you study the people who are in the middle, they turn out to be not people with neither model, but people with both models active. But both models active in different parts of their life. For example, there are workers who are called, blue-collar conservatives. That is, people who work at physical labor, who have a strict father view at home and a nurturant parent view in their jobs, in their union jobs. So people who are in unions in America generally are strict fathers at home, but nurturant in their politics. You have people who are heads of corporations, who are strict fathers in their jobs, but nurturant in their home life. You have teachers who are strict fathers in the classroom, but nurturant at home and in politics, and so on. There are lots of divisions of this sort. Now, what each party is trying to do is hold on to its own base, its own voters, and extend that base to the other side. And the idea, the way this works, is for each of them to activate their model in other people. That's the game. To activate their model in the people in the middle to try to get their votes in politics, to activate their model for politics. So to get the people in the middle to either use a strict father model about politics or a nurturant model about politics. If they can do that, then they get more people voting for them. And that is part of what is going on in American politics every day. Now, because the conservatives have a certain advantage in their think tanks and their intellectuals, they have paid their intellectuals very well, they have built their think tanks, they have a large media concentration, and they have developed language, they have an advantage in framing the issues from a strict father perspective. And what they've done in the public media is define the issues their way. And if you define the issues, you win the debate. Okay? And there's a reason why. And it's very important to see why. It has to do with cognitive linguistics. One thing we know from cognitive science and cognitive linguistics has to do with framing. A frame is a way of understanding a situation. For example, understanding taxes in terms of tax relief and taxes as an affliction, okay? Or any other understanding of a situation. If if you can fix the frame for understanding a situation, then you win. Why? Imagine negating a frame. There's a very famous incident in American politics about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, the American president who was forced to resign in 1974 for illegal activities, before he resigned, he went before the nation and gave a famous speech in which he stood there and said, "I am not a crook," and thereby made everybody think of him as a crook. Right? When I teach frame semantics in an introductory cognitive linguistics course, the very first thing I do is I give an exercise, and the exercise is this. The exercise is, all of you now, ready? Do not think of an elephant. Whatever you do, do not think of an elephant. Right? Did anyone succeed? Right? Okay. The word elephant is defined relative to an image and a frame, which gives a certain amount of knowledge about a large animal with large ears and a trunk and tusks and a tail and so on. Right? When you hear the word elephant, you have to think of an elephant. And if you say don't think of an elephant, you still have to think of an elephant. Okay? Now, what does this say about framing in politics? It says, do not deny the other person's frame. Now, the conservatives know this, and they have language lessons for all of their candidates, and they teach this. But the progressives and Democrats do not know this. And so we get the following situation. Right now, John Kerry is the Democratic candidate who will be running against Bush. Bush makes a claim about Kerry, which is false, which the campaign regularly does. They say, Kerry wants to raise your taxes $900 billion. And the Kerry campaign stupidly comes back and says, John Kerry never said he wanted to raise your taxes $900 billion. And people hear, raise your taxes $900 billion, right? Or, last week, Dick Cheney, who's now in the country, made a false charge against Kerry. He said, Kerry wanted to raise the gasoline tax 50 cents a gallon. Well, it turned out to be false. That wasn't what he wanted to do. So Kerry's campaign came out and said, John Kerry never wanted to raise the gasoline tax 50 cents a gallon, right? And made people think that he did, right? That is, the people running the campaign think they are telling the truth, and that is enough. And this is a major liberal mistake. The progressives in America don't know enough cognitive linguistics. And unfortunately, the conservatives in their think tanks have figured it out intuitively. They've gotten the idea, and the progressives have not. So, here are progressive mistakes. First, just denying what the other side says, using their words. Mistake. Okay? There's another major mistake. It is assumed that by progressives, that all you have to do when the other side says something false is tell the truth. Say what's true. It doesn't work. Because the other side's frame will overcome the facts. Frames overcome facts. Because the frames are in the synapses of your brain. And if the facts don't fit the frame stays there. The facts will not be comprehended and they'll be ignored. So the Democrats constantly make this mistake over and over and over again. They have just set up their first serious think tank. And what does that think tank mostly do? Whenever the Republicans make a false charge, they tell the truth. They say, here's the truth. And they use the Republicans' frame. They don't change the frame. What is necessary is imposing your own values, framing things your way, not their way. Okay? And that's not easy. And let me tell you why it's not easy. Again, the answer comes from cognitive linguistics. There is a phenomenon in the brain that has been discovered by cognitive scientists called hypocognition, which means the lack of ideas you need. That is, it says there are conceptual gaps that you need, where you need a concept, a frame, and you don't have that frame in your synapses. This was discovered back in the 1950s by an anthropologist named Robert Levy, who studied Tahiti. When he went to Tahiti, he was also not only an anthropologist, he was also a psychiatrist. He had been trained in psychiatry and anthropology. And he noticed when he got to Tahiti that Tahitians had a very high suicide rate. A lot of Tahitians were committing suicide. So he started studying Tahitian culture and suicides and discovered something very, very deep. That the people in Tahiti did not have a concept of grief, for grieving. They not only did not have a word for it, they experienced grief. They had the emotion, but they had no concept, no word, no rituals, no idea that grief was normal in certain situations, no idea that there are certain things you can do about grief, and so on. No idea, no rituals for grief, no healing mechanisms for grief. And so, what they did was think, when they experienced grief, that there were demons after them who wouldn't go away, or that they had a terminal illness and they would commit suicide. Now, the idea here is that sometimes there are ideas that you need that where you don't even have the concept, much less the word. And back in 1964, when the conservative Goldwater lost, conservatives had massive hypocognition. They didn't have the ideas they needed. But they invested and built these institutions, the think tanks, things like the American Heritage Foundation or the American Enterprise Institute and so on. They built these think tanks, and the think tanks filled in the conceptual gaps over 30 to 40 years, slowly filled in all of the conceptual gaps. so that they no longer have hypocognition. But the Democrats and the progressives have hypocognition. They have a huge number of frame gaps, places where they need new frames and they don't have them in their synapses, where they're not out there in public. So, and there's a way that you can tell this. Any linguist can tell this immediately. And you have to be a linguist to know that you can tell this. The reason is this. We know from cognitive linguistics that words and expressions are defined relative to frames. Okay? Every word is defined relative to some frame. If there's no frame, you can't get a word for it, because there's no frame to get a word for it. So every word is defined relative to a frame. Now, suppose that a liberal and a conservative are having a debate on television. They go on television, the conservative says, I'm in favor of tax relief. Tax relief has a frame. It has a frame that taxation is an affliction, that the citizens are afflicted parties, and that the president is the hero who's relieving it, and so on. That's the frame. So they can use the two words tax relief. The progressive comes on and he has to give 2 paragraphs to explain what he means. And you see this in America. When I say this, the audience laughs because they see it every day. If you watch political shows, every day you'll see that the conservative has 2 words and the Democrat has to go on and on and on, because there's no frame that can be named. They have to construct frames and get them out into public, and that takes a while. It takes some time to do. It's possible, but they don't even know that that's what they have to do. And so there's a sadness in a linguist watching this, seeing that American progressives don't have all the frames they need and need to construct them, and need to get them out in public, and need to find words for them. They need to find language as well as construct frames. So this is something that most American politicians don't understand if they're progressives. And the conservatives have had intellectuals figure it out and work it out, and they don't need it because it's been done for them. That is what makes American politics right now very dangerous, because the conservatives, not only though they're a minority, have the advantage, the cognitive linguistic advantage. That is, they have all the frames they need, they have the language, they've gotten it into the public discourse, and the other side hasn't done it yet. And one of the reasons that I want to start a political institute for progressives is to enable progressives to be able to catch up in these ways. Now, this is a very hard job, and there's one more thing I should mention that's really deeply important as a fundamental idea. It's something that conservatives know and have learned, and the progressives have not. Conservatives understand what are called strategic initiatives. Cases where they do one thing and it has huge effects. Okay? For example, I mentioned tort reform. Okay? Tort reform is putting a cap, a maximum figure on the amount that someone can receive in a personal injury case when they sue a corporation. Putting a relatively small amount on the amount that they can receive. That's called tort reform. It's a funny word for it, but that's what they have. Now, why did they care so much about tort reform? What would happen if they actually did this? Well, obviously, individuals who have been harmed by corporations, let's say they might have lost an arm or a leg because of something that the corporation did and didn't care about safety or something like that, they wouldn't be compensated. They wouldn't be able to make a living, and they wouldn't get any money in compensation. That's the first thing. But that's not the real reason. The real reason has to do with many other things. If you have such a cap, then the corporations can continue to seek their self-interest indefinitely, and they don't have to worry about safety for the public. They don't have to worry about stopping pollution. They don't have to worry about making safe products, because they can predict the amount that they'll have to pay. It won't be that much. They can build it into the cost of doing business, and then they can just go on their way. That is, they will not have, if you view the corporation as an individual who is disciplined, they can go about making their money freely, and no one can interfere with them. Even if they do not operate for the public good, even if they operate against the public good, they can't be stopped. It means that they can violate all environmental regulations. They can pollute freely. They can do all kinds of awful things, and they can't be stopped. In addition, there is a little-known fact about American politics. In these lawsuits, when the lawsuits are very large, suppose, let's say, 1,000 people sue a company for some injury, the law firms make a lot of money in the lawsuits. The law firms get sometimes 30% of the money. Often they defend people and they lose the cases and they get nothing, but they can get a lot of money out of this. And the very wealthy lawyers, who are called tort lawyers in this case, are, in some states, the main people who support the Democratic Party. That is, they're the main contributors to the opposition to the conservatives. And this is a way of taking the money away from the opposition. So here they might have the idea of, say, let's cap the awards. Isn't that unfair to have very large awards? But the effect is to allow companies to do whatever they want, to harm as many people as they want, and so on, and also to take money away from the opposition. So this is called a strategic initiative. It says one thing, but the effects go widely in many other things. Okay? And in general, progressives don't know how to frame strategic initiatives. What they have is a lot of little programs, a program for this, a program for that, but not broad initiatives that have wide effect. And they need to learn to do that. They've just learned here's one example that I've been convincing a number of people to work on. The people running this initiative are friends of mine, and I'm trying to get them to make it as broad as possible. It's called the New Apollo Initiative. The idea is to have a very large, right now in America, the oil and coal and gas industry, the fossil fuel industry that pollutes the world, uses 25% of the world's fossil fuels and produces 25% of the air pollution in the world. That is supported by American taxpayers, subsidies of $30 billion a year. $30 billion just given to the companies for certain kinds of rights and so on, and tax write-offs and so on. $30 billion a year to help them use oil and coal, to help them pollute. And this is done because the oil companies have a lot of political power. They can give campaign contributions to conservative politicians who vote for them. Now, the Apollo Initiative says take the $30 billion away from the coal and oil and put it into alternative energy that doesn't pollute. And we now have the science to do that. That is, we can have very effective solar panels, hybrid cars, partially electric cars. We can have windmill power, steam power, biomass, etc. All sorts of forms of energy that, so that you wouldn't need all that oil and gas and coal. You can run your cars pretty much without very much gas, mostly on electricity in hybrid cars. And what would happen would be this. If you invested that money in building these alternative energies, you would generate in America 4 million jobs. And they're jobs that would have to be done in America, like building solar collectives and putting them in and installing them and fixing them and so on. They'd be American jobs. If you did that in China, you'd have Chinese jobs and you wouldn't have all the pollution you have here. Beijing, in the next 6 years, is supposed to increase the number of cars by 40%. 40% more cars. And they're not going to be hybrid cars. They're going to be cars using gas with more pollution. If China said, we are going to make hybrid cars, like Japan now makes, instead of oil-burning, gas-burning cars, then you could slowly get rid of the pollution. Okay? And you would have a new energy industry that could then be used for other things as well. In fact, China would probably, in the long run, make much more money by producing better energy and less pollution. But that's not happening here. It's not happening in America if the conservatives win. If the Democrats win, there's a possibility. If the Republicans win, there's no possibility. But this is a strategic initiative for the following reason. It's a proposal about energy that has an effect on jobs. That it also has an effect on international politics, because then America would no longer be dependent on Middle East oil. Imagine America not dependent on Middle East oil. It would not have to have armies in the Middle East to protect its oil supply if it didn't need the oil. Now, right now, third world countries also depend on Middle East oil and oil from Venezuela and Nigeria and so on. Any country with the present technology for alternative energy, if they had the right technology, could be energy producers, not energy consumers. Every country has some way of producing energy, either by sun, by wind, by water, by biomass, and the technology exists to make that happen, but it takes an investment to develop the technology, to build it, and then to export it. Imagine the third world, around the world, where every country produced its own energy, and nobody had to buy Middle East oil. Not only that, imagine that nobody had to buy oil at all, that there was no pollution, that all the energy was non-polluting. There would be no environmental destruction, no health problems with breathing, no pollution in the water. Okay? Not only that, the country would not have to import the oil, which means they would not have to get a loan from the World Bank to buy the oil, and they would not owe the World Bank the interest on the loan. Right? It would change third world development enormously, because every dollar, every yuan invested in the third world has a multiplier effect of 6 in development. So just investing in alternative energy is an enormous investment in third world development and helps the people of the world. That is a possibility, but in America, if George Bush is reelected, that could not happen. All of these are ways of framing situations. If you frame energy as a problem of getting enough oil, you have one set of consequences. If you frame the problem of energy as producing alternative energies, energies like solar energy, wind energy, water energy, and so on, then there are other consequences. And some consequences are much better than others, politically and otherwise. Frame semantics matters. How you frame an issue matters tremendously for the history of the world. That is why cognitive linguistics is so important in politics. Thank you.